Welcome into another edition of the Gig'em 247 Sports Podcast. Lucky to be joined today by Isaac Trotter, a national college basketball writer for 247 Sports and CBS Sports. Isaac, thanks for joining us and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, Texas A&M has had a huge year, I would say, in the portal
Yep.
cycle. So it's always fun. I think the portal is it's interesting right now. The winners, the losers. There's just a lot of intricacies with it. Nearly 2,000 players in the portal in this cycle. But I feel like Texas A&M has had their imprint on this. So looking forward to digging into everything that Buzz Williams has kind of put together this offseason.
That's our reading, and you had Texas A&M as a transfer portal winner, and one of the things you noticed was maybe not so much who they added, but who they were able to keep out of the portal, and chief among them was obviously Wade Taylor. You look at this roster with Anderson Garcia and Solomon Washington and Manny Obaseki. How important do you think it was to keep those guys, that kind of base together? And how much does that go into maybe evaluating portal winners and losers for you?
Yeah, no doubt. Like that piece that we came out was really based on that deadline.
Yeah.
And it was kind of surrounding some of the names that we had potentially heard that, hey, potentially could enter the portal. And
Yeah.
obviously, Wade Taylor would have had a huge market. So keeping him, sometimes the best gets are the ones that you already have is kind of a familiar phrase that floats around on Twitter. Trilly
Yep.
Donovan, someone who does that a lot. And I think Texas A&M is the big example of that because, you're talking about if Wade hit the portal, like he's probably a top 2 or 3 player in the cycle. So to
Yep.
keep him there is just huge. But I think just the ripple effects from everything of, hey, we kept Solomon Washington in the mix. We kept all of our rotation pieces kind of mostly in the mix. Anderson Garcia enters the portal, but quickly exits. That continuity is just everything. And I think it really helped with their potential sell in the portal too, because it's a whole lot easier to go hit the portal when you kind of have a nucleus in place and you're trying to find those missing little pieces. And I felt like Buzz has done a nice job of looking at what this roster is. Hey, what are the 3 biggest holes that we need to fix? How can we fill them? And then he was able to go in the portal and do that. But I don't think he'd have been able to do that if he isn't getting some of these returners back. And so you start to see the mix of what this group could look like. And it's a really, really interesting team that I think is going to have their fingerprints really all over this SEC race. You never want to look ahead too much, but Texas A&M is really built to be really competitive, I think, next year.
It's so hard to predict, right? Because you thought that like last year, this team was coming off a second place finish in the SEC the year before, bringing basically everybody back, and then it was kind of a bit of a rocky up and down road throughout this. So it's hard to project a little bit. Wanted to ask you about Manny Obaseki too, because I think he's kind of a super intriguing guy in that he really wasn't a full-time starter until the latter portion of last year. And as a guy that's a former, a fringe 5-star, I think we had him at number 26. And how rare is that when you cover the transfer portal to have a guy that maybe has now stuck around for 3 years and, has still kind of waited to ascend into that starting role. But how rare do you think that is for him to stick around for 3 years like that?
Yeah, I mean, he is an outlier kind of when you compare what it is, especially just in this portal cycle. Like I said, we have 2,000 players. Now let's do the math, 363 Division I teams, 13 players on each scholarship. That's roughly 4,700 players. So we're talking almost 40% of the college basketball ecosystem is in the portal. And so to keep him is just magnificent, just because if you just think about what he turned into down the stretch, I think he kind of really started to put it together of hey, I got to drive the basketball. I'm getting downhill off the bounce and getting to the rim, because I feel like that really took his game to the next level. And yes, he's not going to be their number one, not top of the scouting report guy next year, but there's a realistic path for him to be maybe number 2, at worst number 3. And that continuity right at the end of the season, I felt like he found something. And to be able to get that maybe another breakout version from him next year at Texas A&M is huge, because if he had hit the portal, I think a lot of coaches, we didn't hear his name a ton in the portal rumblings. Now, maybe I'm talking to the wrong people. Maybe that was there, but I didn't necessarily hear that a ton on my end. But just that's huge just to be able to keep him, because I do think if he hit the portal, I mean, again, what are we looking at? Is he a top 40 transfer, top 50 transfer?
Probably.
So I think, it's the transfer portal rankings. All we focus on is who'd you get? But keeping those guys, keeping Wade Taylor is keeping a top 5 transfer. Keeping Manny Obaseki is a top 40, 50 transfer. Those That's a real part of roster building that I think some of these elite teams in college basketball have mastered over the last couple cycles. I think Texas A&M is trying to build toward that too.
And you look at Farrell Payne, right? Obviously, 247 had him, I believe, top 60 as in terms of transfer. One of the things that I felt like A&M was kind of missing last year was obviously Julius Marble was away from this team for the entire year, and I think that really hit them maybe a little harder than people maybe expected. When you look at Farrell Payne, how much do you think he can bring in terms of maybe an offensive kind of push a little bit, and what do you think he brings to the table?
He is a monster. Like, he is so physical and just his frame. He's like 6'9", 255, just an explosive, powerful athlete. Like, he's going to have some times where you're like, man, is he about to break the backboard on a dunk? Like, he's that type of powerful. And, I think the MO, I think with Texas A&M is out. Like, sometimes the shot selection isn't necessarily the greatest, but if they can get an offensive rebound, like, their best offense is offensive rebounding. And I think that's where it's like, hey, like, what do we need in the portal? We need an elite offensive rebounder to pair with our front court that we already have. Let's go find arguably the best offensive rebounder in the portal in Farrell Payne. And so, like, adding a guy like that to the mix, I just think it was really one of my favorite fits, I think, so far this 2024 cycle. And we have that version of that story coming out. I think we'll have some stuff about Payne in that one, just because elite offensive rebound team finds an elite offensive rebounder who is super strong, super physical. I think we've seen him, his game offensively is a little raw. I don't think he's a guy that you're throwing the basketball into him. Like, hey, like, let's go post you up for, 15, 16 times a game. Like, that's not necessarily his game. But I think as a rim runner, as someone who's going to offensive rebound, as someone who's going to play really, really hard. I mean, again, with how deep this group could be, you don't need him to play 32 minutes. He could probably be a 23 to 26 minute guy. I think you can get a different version of him because when his motor is going, like, he is impressive, man. Like, he is impressive. And I also think, just like with what we've seen in the portal this cycle, bigs like Payne are really expensive and there's not many of them. So to get him when they did and to get him early, I think really sets them up for success moving forward, because there's a lot of really good teams that go, hey, we could really use a traditional 5, and there's not many out there right now.
Yeah, and you look at him as obviously, I think he's got multiple years of eligibility remaining too. Do you think this maybe helps Henry Coleman too? Because they obviously had to play Henry Coleman a little bit out of, at the 5 a little bit. Do you think this maybe has a side benefit on him as well?
Yeah, I do. I kind of wonder about, like, some of those guys that, like, do you really want to guard 5s? And if you look in the league next year, right? Like, Janai Broome is back, so that's a 5 that you're probably going to stick Payne on for a while. Jonas Adu at Arkansas, that's a 5 you're probably going to stick him on. Alabama obviously loads up. They go get Cliff Omarui. Like, that's a 5 that Payne has guarded, right? Like, a lot of history there. Rutgers and Minnesota playing in the Big Ten last year, so we saw a lot of that familiarity. Kentucky's added some bigs. Amari Williams out of Drexel. You still kind of expect Ole Miss. We'll see what that front court looks like. A little bit of a different group. Tennessee still has some talented bigs. So it's interesting, right? Like, there's a lot of bigs that you need. And to have this, like, rotation of, like, Henry Coleman doesn't have to guard these dudes 30 minutes a night. Like, it can be a little bit of a rotation, I think, that can help them. Now, I'm curious how much they play together. I think the playmaking, the passing is a question mark, the floor stretching abilities too, because Payne has a lot of strengths, but he's not going to be a guy that's going to step out and knock down pick and pop 3s and stuff like that. But I'm curious to see how this rotation shakes out, because I feel like there's a lot of flexibility here with a lot of older guys and some guys who've also played a lot of basketball, even though they might not be like 5th-year seniors, but there's a lot of flexibility for Buzz to be pretty creative with his front court rotation. So maybe it is just like, hey, we're going to see Coleman and Payne together at times against some of those bigger teams. Like, like Auburn always wants to play 2 bigs together at the same time. Maybe that's the game where you see both those guys together, but maybe against a team like Kentucky, who wants to play maybe more 5-out spread stuff, you can technically, try to rotate their minutes, and it's more of a 50-50 split.
Yeah, it gives you the options, right? And that's something, A&M didn't maybe necessarily have last year. Going to take a quick break, and when we come back, got a lot more to get to. I think, obviously, one of the biggest additions for A&M out of the transfer portal was Zurich Phelps. We're going to talk about him and a little bit more about this backcourt when we come back from a quick break. Welcome back into the Gig'em 247 Sports Podcast. I am Andrew Hattersley, joined by Isaac Trotter. Final edition of this three prospect class for A&M out of the portal is Zurich Phelps, who was the leading scorer for SMU last year. Comes down to Texas A&M for his final season. What do you think of this fit between him, Wade Taylor, and Manny Obaseki? It's going to be pretty interesting.
It's fascinating because I feel like the big thing I've been really honing in on this cycle is just trying to eliminate positional overlap and trying to find guards that are a little bit different. And, I think that he's going to come in and be somebody that really gets the free throw line a lot. And that's, again, like we talk about Texas A&M with their ability to lean on offensive rebounding, getting the free throw line is huge. So it's like you start to see, like, that's where it's like, I feel like Buzz has done a good job of like, hey, what do we need? What do we need to target? Like, we need that big guard to replace Radford that can get to the free throw line. And Phelps, 35% free throw rate last year is huge. But the other interesting angle with him is Texas A&M's transition offense last year was not very good at all. Phelps is a transition monster. Like I think he rated in like the 89th percentile nationally in transition points per game. So you're talking about somebody that can give you that little instant juice of offense. And I think for a team that like Texas A&M, where sometimes when you can slow them down and get them into half-court game, and it's like, man, if we're getting offensive rebounds, if we're not getting offensive rebounds and get a little clunky, you need that ability to go get those easy buckets in transition. And we saw like some of those elite teams in college basketball last year. If you're great on the glass, which we expect Texas A&M to be with Coleman and Payne, right, and Anderson Garcia, if you can turn those defensive rebounds into instant buckets in transition, in under 10 seconds, that's kind of where I feel like the game is really trending, trying to get those easy looks. And Phelps, I think, will help out with that a lot. Now, there's some questions about him as a shooter, especially as a spot up guy. I think he's going to probably play more on the ball just to get the best version of him, because as a spot up guy, he's not much of a shooter to stretch the floor. But I do think that they're not necessarily going to need him to do a lot of those things. They need him to drive the basketball. And if you can get past that first wave of defender, you can draw a second defender, you can get 2 feet in the paint. I feel like that's the best version of him. You don't necessarily want to see him dribble between his legs 6 times at the top of the key for these step back, fadeaway threes. Like we'll let Wade Taylor do that. You know what I mean?
Right. Do you think that kind of maybe allows Wade Taylor to play a little more off the ball? I know some have felt like they tried to do a little bit last year. Do you think this edition kind of allows him to maybe do that more?
I think so. It really does kind of come down to like just how well Zurich takes care of the basketball. He had a 15% turnover rate last year. Now, he didn't play a ton of point guard. He was a little bit of a combo tweener last year, just with what they had. Chuck Harris out of Butler transferred to SMU. So he didn't necessarily have to play the one all the time, but a little bit too. So like, I think they're both really comfortable with it. And I think you'll see a lot of both of those guys just handling the one, so to speak. But like, again, like it's basketball, like the sport is so much change. It's not necessarily like that 1A, 1B type of like, oh, here's our point guard, you're our shooting guard. It's really kind of changed. And I think that Texas A&M is going to be able to do that. But I'm really, really interested to see like how Wade's game kind of evolves with Phelps, especially on the defensive end, because I think Phelps has a chance to be a really special on-ball defender. There's some stuff there with him, just his positional size, that I think could really help Wade. Maybe you can shift him, save some of his energy defensively. You can hide him on some of the weaker guards in the SEC, because I think Phelps is going to be one of those. I expect him to be one of Texas A&M's best perimeter defenders, and if he's not, I'm going to be a little bit disappointed, because he has all the measurables and all the size to be a really, really elite defender. And I wonder if that's a big part of why he was such a big priority for Texas A&M staff to get him in.
Yeah, you look at, they made him a big priority. Obviously, they went after Jordan Pope and some of those guys, and intriguing too. Just him, Wade Taylor, and Manny Obaseki all played on the same AAU circuit, so certainly familiar with each other. You mentioned the 3-point shooting, and I think that's probably the point of consternation for fans. Obviously, they went out and added CJ Wilcher, who's a really good 3-point shooter, but do you feel like they did enough? Because last year that was a big problem.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I think that's still one of my bigger questions with him. I think I think Wade is a really good three-point shooter. He just takes some really tough ones that kind of sink down his percentages. But obviously, when he's on the floor, you got to guard him really. I mean, the space that he creates, if you're talking about mapping the floor, the space that Wade Taylor creates is still there, even if he's only technically a 30% three-point shooter last year or 31, whatever he finished at. So I do think going into the portal, and they needed a sniper. And I think CJ Wilcher is a really sneaky good player. I think his numbers would have actually been a little bit better last year if he didn't have to play with Keisei Tominaga all the time. Nebraska had a really hard time like playing both of those dudes at the same time. So it's basically like a platoon. Yeah. Sometimes Wilcher was playing 26 minutes. Sometimes he was playing in 15, kind of based on how Keisei was playing, especially on the defensive end, because they basically had the same role and did a lot of the same things well. And, you know, I look up some of the numbers, like Wilcher shot 37% on 99 catch and shoot threes last year. Like that's really, really good. But even more impressive was him off the bounce. Shot 48% on off the dribble threes. You can shoot him. You can kind of run him off a lot of screens. He makes shots off movement. He can get hot in a hurry too. And so I think every time that he steps onto the floor, like, hey, shooter, like that's going to be the scouting report on him. And I think that could open up some of those driving lanes. So I still have some questions about this group as a shooting team. Just when you factor in like, hey, can Jace Carter take another step forward? Like what does this shooting group look like? Are we going to have lineups where it's, you know, Wilcher and Taylor, and that's the only true shooters on the floor? Like if that's the case, I would be a little bit more concerned. But if you have someone else step up, that could potentially, you know, solve some of those problems. But Wilcher and Taylor, honestly, both of those guys can make and take tough ones. And that's a game changer that not a lot of people have. I think Wilcher has a lot more in his bag that hasn't really been showcased yet. And I'm curious to see just how much he can carve out in this rotation, because it's a deep team. And there's a lot of guys in this roster, like you're trying to figure out the minutes rotation. I mean, it is not easy when you're thinking about all of these minutes. But I think Wilcher is going to be somebody that he's just different than the rest of this roster as a catch and shoot guy. And that makes me think that he's going to have a little bit bigger of a role than he had in Nebraska.
I feel like Buzz is going to use non-conference play again to kind of play with all different types of lineups, and they'll kind of start to maybe figure it out come January. I know it drives A&M fans kind of nuts to see that kind of happen. I'll get you out on this, because I think it's been a super intriguing offseason, right? In terms of the SEC, you look at John Calipari going to Arkansas, Mark Pope coming into Kentucky, a lot of movement. Where do you feel like the conference kind of, are there any early favorites that you kind of have, or echelons kind of separating right now? Or do you think it's probably still too early to tell?
Well, it feels like you kind of have to put an asterisk next to Kentucky and Arkansas right now while they kind of play their rosters out together. But I still think Florida is going to be a pretty good team next year. I'm still pretty bullish on that group if they can get Walter Clayton back. You know, you talk about Elijah Martin out of FAU, Will Richard, Walter Clayton. They got a nice little transfer portal class. So I like that group. You know, I kind of like the build of what Kentucky has. Although Kirk Risa, that addition scares the absolute heck out of me. I'm not sure how that one's going to go, but we'll see how that goes. But so far, I think you have to love what Alabama's offseason has been. I think if we were making your way too early SEC power rankings, now I have an editor who's been on me a little bit. Like, I think I have to work on that starting probably next week. So we're hoping for a little bit more commitments.
This is the early start, right?
I know it's already started. And I think I'd probably have Alabama near that top tier, just with you look at what they've done, just the ability to add those shooting, you know, elite freshmen coming in. Cliff Amori is just that rim protector that they just didn't have last year. You know, I put Auburn, I would say, in that top tier as well, with the ability of getting Janai Broome back. You know, they're going to get Denver Jones back. And I think he's one of those candidates of like, I've been pushing this narrative for a while of like, getting a transfer is awesome, but keeping them for that second year is just enormous. You see a lot of big jumps there. I think Denver Jones would be one to potentially watch there. And then we'll see what Tennessee looks like, because, you know, they lose Dalton Connect, they lose Josiah Jordan-James, they lose Santiago Vescovi, and you're like, okay, all right, heading into this year, it'll be the Zakai Ziegler and Jonas Adu show. Well, Adu bounces, and like, I don't think Rick Barnes was super happy about that one. So I would kind of put Texas A&M kind of in that top tier with the Alabamas and the Auburns of the world right now. But I'm still really closely watching what Florida does, what Tennessee does to round out their roster, what Arkansas does, and then obviously what Kentucky does before we kind of really know what this group is going to look like. But, I mean, old teams win in college basketball, right? We've seen that time and time again. And if you just look at this scholarship chart for Texas A&M, you have 8 fifth-year seniors and a couple guys coming in, like Solomon Washington's played a lot of basketball. Pharrell Payne's played a lot of basketball. Like you have 10 rotation guys potentially that have played a ton of ball. And those teams, not perfect, right? Missouri was one of the older teams in college basketball last year. They were winless in the SEC. But you have a chance to outplay preseason expectations. And I think Texas A&M with this veteran group has got to be considered in that mix of tier 1 teams in the SEC.
No doubt. It feels like they're kind of on that slow, right? Made the tournament, won a tournament game last year. They're kind of on that slow upward trajectory a little bit. Isaac, thank you so much, man. I know you've got a lot on your plate for joining us to kind of break everything down. And we'll definitely have you back on, and appreciate you taking a few minutes.
Hey, thanks for having me. Anytime.
Awesome. Thanks, Isaac.